All right, we are good to go. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everyone, and welcome to our weekly Wednesday discussion. So, as most of you know, for the past few months, we have been doing an overview of the book Evolution of Fiqh from Dr. Phillips in order to educate ourselves on the history of fiqh and the madahib, that being, of course, the Islamic schools of thought, as well as order for us to gain an appreciation, mutual respect for the fact that these different schools of thought exist, and in order for us to better understand why these schools of thought came to be and exactly how should we, especially as converts, approach the concept of these Islamic schools of thought. Last week we went over chapter 8, in which we finished doing an historical overview of the compilation and development of fiqh, and Dr. Bilal finishes last chapter on introducing us to another concept known as Taqleed, which is typically translated as following madhab, though the context in which Dr. Bilal uses the word Taqleed is blind following. That's how he describes it in his book, the concept of blindly following a madhab or an imam. And so for chapter 9, Dr. Bilal Phillips makes a case as to why he believes Muslims should avoid fully embracing the concept of Taqleed or blind following. And so that's where we'll be going over, inshallah, today. So he begins the chapter with this kind of a clarification that he is a full supporter and believes in the necessity of having madhabs, having different schools of thought. And it's important to mention this because perhaps due to how the tones and the attitudes that have been portrayed in the past couple of chapters, it could give an indication to the reader that perhaps he's calling for not following madhabs, not believing in following madhabs. So he clarifies here that there is indeed a necessity for these schools of thought, these madahib. And he kind of gives an overview on what we went over in the first couple of chapters, which is the Sharia is a set of general principles for all of mankind to follow. And the different scholars, different founders of these schools of thought help us take those general guidelines and conceptualize them and put them into practice. Right. So as we know, Islam is a religion for all of mankind throughout all of the times. And of course, different cultures and different times are going to be going through different circumstances and different situations. And these scholars, these students of knowledge who develop the different schools of thought, if it wasn't for the work that it was through the work that they put through that we're able to practice Islam and put those general guidelines into practical use through the different situations and cultures that we all go through. And so he just starts by kind of really clarifying that in this book he's not calling for an erasing the madahib, the schools of thought. That's not at all what he's calling for. He understands and makes it clear that there's a necessity for having these schools of thought in order to make Islam practical for us, right? And so he just clarifies that before going into what he is calling for an end for, and that is his definition of blind following of the madahib. he's not against differences of opinion or different schools of thought being around, and he kind of gives an overview of some of the factors which led to these differences of opinion, which were basically inevitable. And we've been going over these factors which led to these differences of opinion in different schools of thought throughout Islamic history. So before we move on, is there anyone here who wants to kind of give us some reminders of some factors which inevitably led to different schools of thought and differences of opinion? Brother Daniel, how about you?
Are you talking about us personally, the choices in which we have personally made to?
No. I'm saying, what are some factors which led to scholars developing different schools of thought, the differences of opinion, the different schools of thought? Can you give us like one factor which kind of led to this type of these different methods developing instead of just having one?
First, and I think one of the most foremost things would be location, thus for the access of particular knowledge.
Absolutely. Perfect. Absolutely. Excellent answer. So, like Brother Daniel mentioned, at some point, different companions, the Sahaba, were living in different locations throughout the Muslim world. And thus, different scholars had access to different resources, different ahadith, different interpretations. And so that inevitably developed differences of opinion and different rulings based off the different resources that these scholars had access to. And so it was inevitable that these different schools of thought would develop. And so that's a very good and probably one of the most major factors that both Dr. BIlal mentions in this chapter and then Brother Daniel just mentioned. And another thing we have to also understand, which he also mentioned, is at this particular set of time, obviously having collaboration and communication with different scholars is a lot more difficult than it is today. They didn't have these things, right? They didn't have cell phones where it was easy to communicate and trade information with other people's knowledge. The best they could really do is either travel, which could take days or even months, or send letters, which also would take a very, very long time. So that further restricted the different abundances of resources that these scholars and these founders of our schools of thought had. So it was inevitable that these different schools of thought developed. And Dr. BIlal is not calling for erasing that. In this chapter, what he is calling for is he's calling for stopping the practice of his interpretation of Taqleed, which is blind following. And he gives a few reasons as to why this concept of blindly following a madhab or a scholar is something that is anti-Islamic, how he puts it. And he gives two major reasons why. The first reason he gives is basically that blindly following a madhab or a particular scholar could lead to rejecting authentic ahadith that goes against the ruling of whichever imam of the madhab you follow or what have you. And doing that type of action could be a form of shirk. And the shirk that, which of course means attributing partnership to Allah. And so the shirk that he refers to specifically is shirk fi tawheed al-ittiba'. Ittiba' basically meaning like following. So he's essentially talking about how, as we're told in the Quran many, many times, that okay, Brother Hasid, you have your hand up. Can you wait till it finishes? Something you wanted to kind of quickly clarify?
Yeah, but I said that this Bilal Phillips, this is his opinion. This is not the majority opinion of Ummah. This is his personal opinion, and obviously it is based on his inclination to basically Saudi mindset.
Well, we can have that discussion.
Yeah. So I just like to bring this that this is because
and we
because
clarify. I've been clarifying here that this is, of course, Dr. Bilal's opinion, and this is his particular stance. Like I mentioned before, Taqleed does not necessarily have to mean blind following. That's how he is interpreting it. And so, yes, I do. I have been making it clear that this is Dr. Bilal Phillips' opinion specifically. Anything else, brother Hasib? I'm sorry, actually, I kind of cut you off.
No, that's fine.
All right. So, as we were saying, so shirk fil tawheed al ittida. Basically, that means how he is translating this is, as we know, when it comes to sami'na wa ta'ala, we hear when we obey. There are only two beings who we do that for. Of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our Lord and Creator, and His Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who, of course, is Allah's spokesperson on this earth. And we're told many times in the Quran that we follow the Prophet, to obey the Prophet. So it's very, very clear that when it comes to religious rulings, the Prophet's word is law. And nothing in terms of religious rulings can be overcome by that. Nothing can overrule that. And so in this particular chapter, Brother Bilal Phillips is saying that he believes that this concept of blindly following an imam or a madhab could lead one to rejecting authentic hadith in preference to the opinion of a scholar, and that this could kind of lead to a form of shirk. And so that's the first reason he gives as to why he is calling for no longer practicing his interpretation of Taqleed, which he's again translates it as blind following. The second reason he gives as to why he is against Taqleed is he says in this chapter that this particular practice is actually contradictory to the attitudes and the practices of the founders of these schools of thought, of these madahib. And for the past few months, we'll be going over these chapters. As you all know, we spent a good amount of time going over the basic biographies of the different founders of the schools of thought throughout Islamic history. And each time we would speak about their particular attitudes towards making rulings and their attitudes towards even their students recording their rulings, right? And so one particular practice that we saw that was found in a good majority of the founders that we went over was that they were very flexible in their rulings, aka their main priority was to identify the truth of the Quran and the Sunnah. And if they found any particular resources, like any particular hadith or saying of the Prophet ﷺ, that was contradictory to their rulings, they would have no problem immediately change their ruling and change their mind, because a lot of them made it very clear that They're human beings, of course. They are not infallible. They do not have access to every single hadith and every single saying of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, based off of that, they do not want their students or their followers to treat them as if their word was on that level. And he provides a few quotations, just kind of really show an example to us, the readers, by giving us different quotes and instances of the four major schools of thought in regards to their attitudes towards his understanding of blindly following. And so, inshallah, we'll go over one or two examples of each of the four madhab that he mentions in this book. So the first one he goes over, of course, is Imam Abu Hanifa of the Hanafi madhab. And as we went over before, Imam Abu Hanifa he would typically discourage his students from writing down his rulings and his opinions. And Dr. BIlal even quotes him having a discussion with one of his students, Abu Yusuf, who was one of his major students. And he said to him, woe be unto you, Yaqub, not write down all you hear from me, for surely I may hold an opinion today and leave it tomorrow, hold another tomorrow and leave it the day after. So again, highlighting that Imam Abu Hanifa himself was flexible. He knew that his knowledge was limited, and if there was a hadith that was presented to him that was authentic, which was contradictory to his previous understanding, he would abandon that understanding and go with the hadith. Right. Another quote he brings up in terms of Abu Hanifa is, and we went over this one before, is when Abu Hanifa said to one of his students, if a hadith is found to be sahih, authentic, then it is my method, it is my way. So again, highlighting that Imam Abu Hanifa, his primary concern was to follow the Quran and the Sunnah and to help others follow the Quran and the Sunnah. He was not concerned about people following his particular madhab or his particular way. He was really concerned with helping people follow the Quran and the Sunnah. And this is sorry about that, quickly. All right. Sorry about that. And we've seen this attitude throughout all the schools of thought. So up next, he goes over Imam Malik. And he again mentions that Imam Malik never hesitated to change his rulings, even if he uttered these rulings in public, if there was another reliable source that was presented to him. And he provides an historical example how Imam Malik used to tell people that they would not have to do wudu and do it in between their toes, have the water done in between their toes, purely due to the fact that he did not have come across a hadith that elaborated otherwise. One of his students informed him of a hadith that they have heard that was authentic, which essentially said the Prophet ﷺ would wash in between his toes with his little finger when he was making wudu. And when Imam Malik heard this, he quickly changed his stance and was telling people that this is what they need to do when they make wudu. So again, another example of how the founders of these schools of thought were flexible in their rulings, and their primary concern was following the Quran and the Sunnah. So that's Imam Malik. An example he gives of Imam Shafi'i. I'll just mention one right here. If you guys remember, when we went over Imam Shafi'i, he mentioned two particular madhabs that were under him. Does anyone remember what those two madhabs were? They had specific names attributed to Imam Shafi'i.
Brother Kenneth, can you repeat the question? It was at which madhabs were based off of
So,
Shafi'i?
we were going over Imam al-Shafi'i a few weeks ago, or like a month or so ago. We mentioned that during the development of his madhab, there were two names. There was one madhab and there was another madhab under Imam Shafi'i. They had two specific names. And I was asking if anyone remembers what the names of those two madhabs under Imam Shafi'i were.
Just to pinpoint, is one of them a major one and one of them that is no longer existent?
One of them is no longer existent, yes.
Is it the one that was very? No, I think that's one of Malik. I know that Hanbali was based off of some of the books and the compilations that Shafi had made. Is that correct? At least for one of them.
Right. No, I'm referring to Brother Daniel, to what his students call at the time Madhab al-Qadim, the old Madhab, and Madhab al-Jadid, the new Madhab. So if we remember, when Imam al-Shafi'i
It migrated from
I believe,
Iraq over to Egypt.
Iraq to Egypt. Yes, thank you. He was introduced to a whole new variety of authentic hadith and resources, right? And when he was exposed to these new resources that he was not familiar with, it caused him to change a lot of his previous rulings, to where his students called that the one that he developed in Egypt al-Madhab al-Jadid, which means the new Madhab, and the rulings that he had previously before his migration, al-Madhab al-Qadim, the old Madhab. So again, stressing the point that these founders were not did not have a sectarian mindset. Their mindset was not, this is my madhab, and my madhab is this way, and this is how it's got to be. That was not their primary concern. Their primary concern was, again, following the sunnah. They made rulings based off what they knew of the sunnah and the Quran, and if they found anything that proved their previous rulings wrong, they would change it, right? So that's an example of Imam al-Shafi'i. In terms of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal of the Hanbali madhab, we already mentioned before, like Brother Daniel, we've spoken about it a number of times, that in terms of qiyas or ijtihad, Imam Hanbal, Ahmad ibn Hanbal was so uncompromising and so dedicated to the concept of staying on the sunnah and following the sunnah, that he would even take weak hadith before he would make his own deducted rulings. Of course, being the fact that those weak hadith themselves had certain guidelines and principles that they had to abide, but even he would refer weak hadith over his own deduced rulings, right? And a quote from Imam Ahmed that Brother Phillips shares is, he says, whoever rejects an authentic hadith of Allah's Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is on the verge of destruction. So these are some examples of the general attitudes of the founders of these different schools of thought in regards to their students and others